Thanks very much, Matt. I'm Dave Barlow from Boston. And it's my pleasure to be here this morning. Really, the Festschrift, it strikes me as such a terrific tribute. There's no other field of endeavor I know of where something like this centuries-old tradition, where upon occasions such as this, what do? We get together and share ideas and share what we're thinking. And of course, relate some of it to the person we're honoring today. And I can't think of anybody who deserves this kind of a tribute more than Alan, for the influence he's had on our field. He was reminding me, I have to digress a little bit. I'm sure some of you will do the same and will excuse me. But Alan was reminding me just out in the anteroom here about, we go back a long ways. You know, and I guess in this occasion we can say it, it's just about 50 years. Very close to 50 years. And in the early days, we'd often meet, of course we're at different universities, so we'd meet up at the meetings, and we eagerly joined into the various professional societies and associations, and one of them was at the time called AABT, the fledgling Behavior Therapy Association. And we were very involved, and we'd work our tails off all day. We wanted to be on every committee. We wanted to give as many talks as we could, typical young, ambitious kind of behavior. And but what we began to notice, some of us, Terry and I and others who would be at these meetings, is that, you know, late afternoon, Alan would kind of slip away. And where's Alan? Well, we'd go on, be cocktail hour, and then we'd say, you know what, we can't go out to dinner without Alan. So it wasn't long before we learned what he was doing. And it will come as no surprise, I think, to any of you. He had slipped up to his room where he was writing a paper. You know, so we go roust him out of his room and bring him to dinner and spend the night laughing until we cried, of course, you know, with him there. And there's such terrific memories now going back to that era. Matt, do I need to do something here with this? Yeah. Also, just to say one more thing about how far back we go. Our careers, really, because we're approximately the same age, so say the same thing about Terry, maybe I will before too long, but our careers have really run in parallel. And as a result, we've done a lot of the same things. We've done a lot of different things as well, but we've engaged in, a lot of the same activities, occupied some of the same offices, but there's a very interesting thing that I took advantage of early on, and that is, most of the time, Alan did it first. So my experience early on was that, and others too, if Alan did it, it's probably a pretty good idea. This might be a good next step. So riding along on that wave and taking advantage of it, Alan was president of this AABT, going way back into the 70s. The next year, I was president. It worked out pretty well. Alan had solved a lot of the problems, and there we were. Then he decided to take on the editor of the journal Behavior Therapy. Now, as you know, Alan is, if there's one thing he is superb at, it's starting a journal. Alan and Sarah are well aware of that. If somebody wants to start a journal, the first thought in their heads is often, ask Alan. Let's get Alan to do it. And, so, in fact, that particular journal, Cyril Franks had it, but Cyril ran it as kind of his own magazine, and there wasn't a lot of formality to it. So Alan was basically the founding editor of Behavior Therapy in terms of introducing all the systems, got all the kinks out of the way, then I came in and did it. Smooth as silk. And we did that several times. Society of Clinical Psychology decided to start a journal. What did they do? They asked Alan to be the founding editor. He worked out all the kinks, then I took over. A year at the Center for Advanced Studies, Alan and Terry did that early on, back it's got to be a good idea. So several years later, I did it, and on, some other things as well. And again, we did some different things. So the problem was that, a couple of years ago, I really began to start dragging a little bit. I was getting tired. I was keeping an eye down here in New Haven. Says, Alan, when the hell are you going to retire? This must not be the right time. I need to keep going, right? But finally, I couldn't wait any longer. A year ago, I took the plunge and transitioned to emeritus. So, Alan, I'm delighted to see that my timing was not too far off and that you are finally retiring. It must be the right thing to do. So let's see. I'm just going to give a 30,000-foot flyover of a couple of the ideas that we've been working on over the years, 10, 12 minutes or something. But in so doing, Alan, in my experience, there are two qualities that have really stood out over the decades in terms of his academic career. One is, and everyone I think will agree with us, he thinks big. He takes the big picture approach. He stands back and says, where are we maybe going wrong here? What kind of an approach do we really need to take? And this quote is taken from when he took over the journal Behavior Therapy. He wrote, as editors are accustomed to doing, a bit of an introduction about future directions for the journal. And Alan said this, and it was really, I think, very prescient in many ways, as he so often is. And that was, in really putting together our interventions as we were doing. That's what we were all about in those days. Maybe we should pay more attention to what we're treating and really look at what are the mechanisms, what are the moving parts in some of the psychopathology that we're attempting to address in our interventions. And could we then tailor our treatments more specifically to some of that? And as he says, that might go a long way to advancing understanding, and more research might focus on careful behavioral analysis of problems initially, as well as treatments that can ameliorate them. And of course, within that term behavioral analysis, was our very much shared. Another thing we both did was this focus on single case functional analysis, single case experimental designs, and people like Tom Crediwill came along and really has done terrific work on that over the years. And we did share this kind of notion that perhaps, as Matt and I wrote in a paper 6 or 8 years ago, why can't we be more idiographic in our research? Why can't we focus more on the actual behavioral analysis of the individual? That in itself is an interesting question going over the decades, but certainly we did share that. Well, applying that kind of thinking to our own work, this is where we'll do the 30,000-foot flyover. I have studied most of my career, as some of you know, anxiety and panic and emotional disorders more generally. And early on, this is really early 80s, although we published it in 85, we captured, really for the first time, a psychophysiological profile of a panic attack. Is this the pointer? Maybe not. Okay. Oh, that's all right. Oh, I see. Trying to confuse me, Matt. All this high-tech stuff. These guys do this research in tech, right? Leaves us way behind. Disadvantage. But what happened was the concept of a panic attack was really only introduced a few years earlier, 1980 into the nomenclature. And although people had sort of recognized it over the decades, it had never really been formalized. And one of the qualities of panic attacks is they occurred at very unexpected times. In fact, they used to be called spontaneous panic attacks until It was decided that term was very unscientific. And, but clearly they were, on the part of the patient, unexpected, unpredictable, and it gave rise to a disorder that became known as panic disorder, as you all know. And it was a very real phenomenon. You know, it wasn't something that people were just reporting in their heads. Here it is, showing a massive autonomic kind of response. But, and so the early attempts to sort of incorporate this into some kind of a system of classification, and I was at a lot of these meetings, it would be, well, what is panic disorder? What makes it a disorder? And my biological psychiatry colleagues would typically say, well, it's the frequency of them. You know, well, how frequent do they need to be? So, well, Don Klein would say, well, we should have at least 10, you know, over the course of a lifetime. And then other people would say, well, what about 3? What about per month? You know, so we spent all this time, how many panic attacks should there be? We ended up with 4 in a month period or something like that, some crazy thing. And it turned out, even back in the 80s, that these are the secondary criteria that, B criteria, we call them, that were introduced in the late 80s in DSM-3. It turned out it wasn't the panic attacks at all that were basically the problem. It was a setting event, if you like. It was how the individual reacted to the panic attacks. And so those criteria became incorporated into the nomenclature, and you can see basically these criteria reflect the notion that people, certain people, but not all people, in fact not even most people, became very anxious at the possibility of having another panic attack and would react to any cue that might signal to them this unpredictable, uncontrollable kind of event. And so with that change, then the counting became easy. All you needed was 1 in your whole life. You know, if in fact you became anxious about having the next one, and that anxiety was severe enough that it interfered with your functioning. So it wasn't long before, again, stepping back and taking this broad picture, that we realized, you know, this really occurs in a lot of disorders. And what they share is that there is an intense emotional experience. In the case of panic, for example, 15-20% of the population experiences panic attacks on occasion. It's a very heritable but non-specific response to stress, much like tension headaches, irritable bowel syndrome, hypertension, you know, any number of what we call stress responses. Panic attacks simply another one. But for most people, it never develops into a disorder. In fact, it's usually kind of a minor thing. People will attribute it to something they ate, or they had a fight with their boss or something, and go on with their life. They'd make these positive, controlling kind of attributions. And then it seemed to us that this is true across a number of disorders. And that furthermore, this reaction, which we called anxiety, panic being the basic emotion of fear, which we called anxiety, was really more of a temperamental response, a temperamental kind of set of reactions that people would carry with them to many stressful situations in their life. And people, of course, have been doing research on temperaments for years under a variety of different terms, behavioral inhibition, negative affect, Tellegen and that group. And of course, Eysenck's famous term of neuroticism. But what it all captured was this consensual definition of frequent and intense negative emotions across the spectrum that are associated with this notion of uncontrollability, inadequate coping response in response to these intense negative emotions or other stresses in one's life, negative thinking and the like. If you unpack this temperament, there are a lot of what we call transdiagnostic constructs that kind of pop out. And these are just some of them. There are others as well. But these were some that seemed important to us. And what had happened was, for individual emotional disorders, people were often focusing on one or the other as being perhaps specifically associated with that disorder. So for panic disorder, people focused on this construct called anxiety sensitivity. What it really means is anxiety focused internally on somatic kinds of manifestations of emotion. And the people with panic disorder, of course, very apparent. You know, they have the slightest perturbation, and their heart rate increases for whatever reason. They become, let's say, hot, or have some other, they're continually scanning themselves for these kinds of reactions. And because they think it might be much of this is implicit, but it might be the beginnings of the next panic attack. And so they assiduously avoid these sensations. The best example in panic disorder is that at coffee break, people with panic disorder would avoid the caffeine like the plague. They'd go for the decaf, if anything. So they had learned all of these avoidance. So these kinds of constructs, but then we discovered that, in fact, these constructs cut across all of these disorders characterized by intense negative emotion. They're not restricted to one disorder or the other. And you can see the anxiety sensitivity, decreased mindfulness. You have to have a fine touch with this thing, too. Another thing that gets harder as we get older, right? Experiential avoidance, I'm not even going to try anymore. Experiential avoidance, where you're avoiding a lot of internal negative kinds of feelings. There is also the attempt to suppress some of these emotional experiences. There's the constructs of worry and rumination that serve, as Tom Borkovic demonstrated decades ago, as a dampening effect on some of this negative affect, negative emotion. They're functionally related to the intense emotion. Getting back to the functional analysis. And of course, they'll stand by negative appraisals and attributions, so brilliantly explicated by Tim Beck, and resulting in the transdiagnostic treatment of cognitive therapy. But in many ways, it seems to us, as we looked at these constructs that were increasingly identified as transdiagnostic, it was like the phenomenon of hands on the elephant. They'd be associated with specific disorders. This disorder, not that one. Cognitive therapy arose in the context of depression. Again, anxiety sensitivity in the construct of panic disorder, and so on. And so we thought, what if we take these constructs, and what happens, in terms of the functional analysis? Well, as I indicated, if you have this very negative reactivity to emotional experience, what happens is you engage in some avoidant behavior, and as Wegner demonstrated many years ago, it has the paradoxical effect of increasing it in intensity and frequency. That's the short statement. That you could unpack that into an hour's lecture. And this is basically what happens. And what seems to be the setting event for that? It's people with a neurotic temperament. That seems to really reflect it. And that's this diagram here, on a dissertation by Laura Campbell Sills, one of my students. So if you look across the emotional disorders, you can really take this kind of phenomenon and cut across these disorders. One of the terrific developments, really, I think it was a good development early on, was getting these thinly sliced kinds of descriptions of psychopathology, individual disorders. But it quickly became, and that generated a lot of research, but it quickly became apparent that this was, had reached this end. We were ignoring underlying kinds of themes that cut across these disorders. And so you look at, the kinds of sensations, panic attacks, sensations of unreality, ego dystonic, intrusive thoughts that underlie, in that case, OCD. Just take this another one. Rockman showed in the 70s and 80s We all have, under stress, these ego-dystonic, intrusive thoughts. It's a very normal thing to have. You know, outrageous kinds of thoughts you'd never admit even to your best friends. But they go in one ear and out the other for most of us. People with OCD, the emotion, the temperament gets attached to it. They try to suppress it. Bang, pretty soon it's exploding in their head. And I think you can cut across all of the disorders. So we developed a transdiagnostic treatment. We attempted to put together something that would attack some of these constructs, which are part of neuroticism directly. And we did a clinical trial recently. I'll just run through this, where we compared, it was an equivalence trial, non-inferiority, really equivalence trial. And we compared this treatment to the best existing treatments, including the one for panic disorder, for the single diagnosis we called, using single diagnosis manuals, except we use this transdiagnostic treatment. And what we found is that what we call the unified protocol was basically, we get a little more retention with that protocol, but beyond that, there was no significant difference. Basically, this protocol was as good as each of the very strong individual protocols, some of which we had developed in our clinic, both at post-assessment and 6 months follow-up. And furthermore, this change in anxiety sensitivity, you see it cuts across all the disorders. It's not just panic disorder. Now what we're doing, though, and the other quality of Alan, besides thinking big, is he is our skeptic in the field. He'll look at some data and say, wait a minute, that's a pile of crap. You know, you haven't thought of this, you haven't thought of that, you haven't thought of the other thing, and that's not going to go anywhere. And we all know in our field that's a very valuable quality to have. So Alan might say, you know, well, you're not doing any better than we did 30 years ago. You know, we get about the same, and he's right. So we need to individualize, personalize this treatment. And to do so, we're using some single case approaches and looking at different ways we can really identify individual qualities. I won't go into this, to try to make the treatment more efficient and more effective by targeting. So Alan, it's been a great run. It's been a great 50 years. It's been a pleasure to be part of it all. And I appreciate being here. Thank you.